12-year-old Liam Parker stood trembling in court. "I saw him push Mr. Carson down the stairs," he said, his voice shaking. Gasps filled the room as the security footage confirmed it. Mr. Turner caught in the act. But what came next was far more terrifying than anyone expected. 12-year-old Liam Parker sat stiffly on the hard wooden bench in the courtroom, his small hands clenched into fists. His mother, Jessica Parker, sat beside him, her face pale and drawn. Across the room, his teacher, Mr. Turner, a tall, well-dressed man in his 40s with graying hair, sat with his lawyer. Mr. Turner's expression was calm, too calm. Liam's heart hammered painfully against his ribs as the judge, Honorable Claire Benson, called the session to order. The heavy thud of the judge's gavel seemed to echo inside his head, each strike matching the frantic pounding in his chest. The courtroom's cold, fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead, casting a harsh glow over the dark mahogany walls. The polished surface of the stand reflected Liam's pale, terrified face as he stared down at his trembling hands. His mouth was dry, his palms damp. He wanted to run, to disappear, but he knew there was no turning back now. "Liam Parker, you've requested to make a statement," Judge Benson said. Her sharp eyes, magnified by her reading glasses, narrowed slightly. Her expression was severe but not unkind. "Please, step forward." Liam's legs felt like lead as he rose from the bench. His mother's hand brushed against his back in silent reassurance, but it didn't help. His throat tightened painfully as he made the long walk to the witness stand. He could feel the weight of every eye in the room pressing down on him, the quiet rustling of suits, the soft murmurs from the back row, the click of a pen in the prosecutor's hand. His gaze flicked toward Mr. Turner. Their eyes met. Turner's expression didn't change. His face remained carefully composed, almost bored. But his eyes... Liam's stomach twisted painfully at the cold, predatory glint beneath the surface. Turner didn't look nervous. He didn't look angry. He looked calculating. Liam swallowed hard and climbed into the stand. His feet barely touched the floor. His hands gripped the edge of the wooden surface as he glanced toward his mother. Jessica's lips were pressed into a thin line, her eyes wide with fear and silent encouragement. Her hands were clasped tightly in her lap, knuckles white. She nodded once. Taking a shaky breath, Liam forced himself to meet the judge's gaze. I have to tell the truth about Mr. Turner," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The courtroom went still. Even the faint buzzing of the lights seemed to fade into silence. Judge Benson's gaze sharpened. "And what is that truth?" Liam's mouth was so dry his tongue felt glued to the roof of his mouth. He forced himself to speak. "I saw Mr. Turner in the school basement." Turner's head tilted slightly. His lawyer leaned in and whispered something, but Turner didn't respond. His eyes stayed locked on Liam. "He was with someone," Liam continued, his voice shaking. His heart hammered so hard it made his chest hurt. "They were arguing, and then—" His throat tightened, his hands curled into fists. "And then I saw him push that person down the stairs." A collective gasp swept through the courtroom like a wave. Someone in the back row muttered a curse under their breath. The prosecutor sat forward, his eyes suddenly bright with attention. Judge Benson's face remained impassive, but her eyes darkened slightly. Turner's lawyer stood immediately. "Objection. Overruled." Judge Benson's tone was cutting. Liam's gaze darted toward Mr. Turner. For the first time, Turner's mask slipped, his jaw tightened. His eyes flashed dangerously. The lawyer leaned toward him again, but Turner ignored him. His gaze stayed fixed on Liam, unblinking, assessing. Liam's legs trembled beneath the stand. His chest felt tight, like he couldn't breathe. He told me no one would believe me." His voice cracked. He said if I told anyone, I'd regret it. Turner's mouth curved, the barest hint of a smile. Do you understand the weight of this accusation, Liam? Judge Benson's voice was steady, but there was a new edge beneath it. I'm not lying, Liam whispered. I saw him. Turner's lawyer stood. Your Honor, this is highly irregular. I said overruled. Judge Benson's gaze didn't waver. The courtroom's atmosphere shifted, from quiet curiosity to palpable tension. The prosecutor stood. Your Honor, may I enter Exhibit A into evidence? The bailiff approached, carrying a thin tablet. The prosecutor clicked a button. A grainy, black-and-white security video appeared on the screen in front of the courtroom. The footage showed the dimly lit basement of the school. Turner was there, standing close to another man, Mr. Carson, the school janitor. Their gestures were sharp, aggressive. Mr. Carson raised his hands defensively. Turner stepped closer. Mr. Carson tried to back away, but Turner lunged forward and shoved him hard. The figure on the screen stumbled backward, disappearing from view. The video froze. A woman in the back row covered her mouth with her hand. Another murmur of disbelief spread. But then what? Liam's hands trembled on the edge of the stand. Then he saw me. A ripple of tension passed through the courtroom. And what did he do? Liam's hands curled tighter around the wood. He came toward me. Judge Benson's eyes narrowed. Did he say anything? Liam's heart thudded painfully in his chest. He forced himself to speak. He said, if you tell anyone, you'll regret it. Judge Benson's mouth tightened. Turner sat back in his chair, completely still. His gaze was razor sharp. For the first time, Liam could see the mask slipping. The carefully maintained facade of the respectable teacher was peeling away, revealing something cold and dangerous beneath. Turner's lawyer whispered something frantically. Turner didn't respond. Liam, why didn't you say something before? Liam's chin trembled. I was scared. Turner's smile sharpened at that. And why are you saying it now? Judge Benson pressed. Liam's eyes burned with tears. Because Mr. Carson deserves the truth, and I couldn't live with myself if I stayed quiet. A heavy silence filled the room. Judge Benson's gaze lingered on Liam for a moment longer before turning toward Turner. Mr. Turner, do you wish to respond to this testimony? Turner's lawyer rose. My client has nothing to say at this time. Turner's eyes glittered darkly beneath his graying brows. His smile had disappeared entirely. His gaze stayed fixed on Liam, cold and cutting. Liam felt his heart beating violently in his chest. His breath hitched painfully as he climbed down from the stand and walked back toward his mother. Jessica pulled him into a tight embrace. You did the right thing, she whispered. Liam's eyes didn't leave Turner. Turner's smile had vanished completely. His gaze followed Liam, calm, calculating, dangerous. And in that moment, Liam knew this wasn't over. Not yet. The grainy black and white footage flickered on the courtroom monitor, casting an eerie glow over the polished wood paneling. The image was shaky, distorted at the edges, but the figures were unmistakable. The dimly lit basement hallway of the school stretched out into a narrow corridor. Mr. Turner's tall figure filled the frame as he stepped into view, his dark suit crisp against the pale cinder-block walls. He was leading someone, a smaller, slighter man, by the arm. The man resisted, twisting his body, but Turner's grip was ironclad. Liam's breath hitched painfully in his chest as the video progressed. There was no audio, but it didn't matter. The aggression in Turner's posture, the way his shoulders squared and his head tilted downward toward the man. It was all too clear. Turner's hand shot out, shoving the man's shoulder. The other figure stumbled backward, raising his hands in a defensive gesture. Turner stepped closer. His mouth moved rapidly, his free hand jabbing toward the man's chest. The man shook his head, backing toward the edge of the frame. Turner's hand twitched, and then, without warning, he lunged forward. Gasps echoed through the courtroom as Turner's hands shot out and shoved the man hard in the chest. The figure stumbled back. His legs hit the edge of the stairwell. His arms flailed as he tried to catch himself, but there was nothing to hold on to. His body disappeared from view with a sharp, sickening jolt. The video cut off. Liam's stomach turned violently. His hands gripped the edge of the wooden bench so tightly his knuckles ached. His breathing quickened. He knew what happened next. The sound of the body hitting the concrete floor beneath the stairs, the twisted position of the limbs, the terrifying stillness afterward. But he didn't need to see it. He could feel it all over again, like he was standing in that hallway. "That's impossible," Turner's lawyer said, his voice sharp and cutting as he shot to his feet. "This footage is inconclusive at best." Liam's eyes widened. His mouth opened, but the words stuck in his throat. He forced them out. "That's him," he whispered. His gaze darted toward Turner, who sat perfectly still in his seat. "I was there. I saw it." Turner's expression didn't change, not at first, but Liam saw the brief flicker of tension in his jaw, the way his hand tightened around the arm of his chair. A muscle in his cheek twitched. His eyes, once calm and calculating, darkened. "Who was the man in the video?" Judge Benson's voice was steady, but there was a new undercurrent beneath it, sharp and dangerous. Liam's throat tightened. His palms were clammy against the polished wood of the stand. "Mr. Carson," he said quietly. "The school janitor." The prosecutor's gaze hardened. "Mr. Carson was found dead in the basement stairwell," he said grimly. The room went deathly silent. Someone in the back row whispered something, a nervous edge in their voice. A sharp shuffle of shoes echoed as one of the court officers adjusted his position. Turner's lawyer shifted uneasily beside him. He leaned toward Turner, whispering something low and hurried. Turner didn't respond. His gaze stayed locked on Liam. Liam's pulse hammered painfully in his ears. His mouth was dry. His legs felt numb beneath him, but he forced himself to stay upright. "I'm not lying," Liam said. His voice was stronger now. His back straightened, his hands curling into fists. "I know what I saw." Turner's eyes narrowed. The calculating calm was gone, replaced with something colder, more dangerous. The prosecutor leaned toward the bench. "Mr. Parker, you're saying that you witnessed Mr. Turner physically assault Mr. Carson, which resulted in his death?" "Yes," Liam said. His voice didn't shake this time. Turner's lawyer stood. "Objection. This is circumstantial. There's no direct evidence that Mr. Turner intended to harm Mr. Carson." "He pushed him," Liam said, his voice cutting through the objection like glass. "He meant to hurt him." Turner's mouth curled slightly. His eyes gleamed darkly beneath his neatly combed hair. The prosecutor held up a sheet of paper. "We have the coroner's report, Your Honor. Cause of death, severe trauma to the head and spinal cord from a fall." He paused. "Consistent with being pushed down a flight of stairs." The judge's gaze sharpened. Turner's lawyer clenched his jaw. "Objection," the lawyer repeated. "We don't know if the push was intentional." "I saw it," Liam repeated, his voice clear and unwavering. "It was intentional." Turner's eyes darkened further. His hand flexed on the table in front of him, the veins in his wrist standing out beneath his skin. His lawyer whispered something else, but Turner's gaze never left Liam. The courtroom was suffocatingly still. Judge Benson's gaze shifted toward Turner. "Mr. Turner, do you have anything to say about this testimony?" Turner's smile returned, a thin, icy line. "Not at this time, Your Honor." Liam's stomach twisted painfully. Turner's tone was too controlled, too measured. His eyes glittered with something dangerous beneath the calm surface. "Liam," the prosecutor said, his voice softer now. "When you saw Mr. Turner push Mr. Carson, did he say anything afterward?" Liam's heart pounded painfully. His mouth opened, then closed. His hands curled against the polished wood of the stand. "Yes." "And what did he say?" Liam's eyes darted toward Turner. His throat tightened painfully. "He said," Liam's voice cracked, "he said no one would believe me." Turner's smile sharpened at that. "And he was wrong," Judge Benson said coldly. Turner's lawyer stiffened. "Your Honor." "Sit down, counselor," Judge Benson snapped. Liam's breath quickened. His heart pounded so loudly he could barely hear the next words spoken. His chest felt tight, his hands still shaking. "Liam, are you sure it was Mr. Turner?" the prosecutor pressed. "Yes," Liam said firmly. His voice didn't waver. "I'm sure." Turner's lawyer's mouth opened, but Turner's hand shot out and touched his sleeve. The lawyer hesitated, then sat back down. Turner's gaze stayed on Liam, cold and sharp as glass. "Why didn't you tell anyone sooner?" Judge Benson asked. Liam's shoulders tensed. I was scared." His voice was small now. He said if I told anyone, I'd regret it." Turner's smile curled again. His hand flexed on the table. "But you're saying it now," the prosecutor said. Liam's chin lifted slightly. His hand steadied on the edge of the stand. "Because Mr. Carson deserves the truth." A ripple of murmurs passed through the crowd. Judge Benson's gaze hardened. "The court will recess for review of this testimony." The gavel struck hard against the wood. Turner's eyes never left Liam as the courtroom stirred around them. His gaze was steady and unblinking, a predator sizing up prey. Liam forced himself not to look away. He could feel it. The cold threat beneath Turner's gaze. Turner wasn't finished yet. Not even close. Liam's hands curled into fists as he stepped down from the stand and walked back toward his mother. Jessica pulled him into a tight hug, but Liam's eyes never left Turner. Turner sat perfectly still at the defense table, his lawyer speaking rapidly beside him. He didn't respond. His gaze followed Liam. A slow, thin smile curved Turner's mouth, and Liam knew this wasn't over. Not even close. Mr. Turner's lawyer stood. "My client has been a respected teacher for over 20 years. He's never had any issues with the law." The lawyer's tone was smooth, confident, the kind of practiced authority that came from years of knowing the system would bend in your favor. He adjusted his tie with a casual flick of his wrist, his gaze cool as he glanced toward the jury. His words were calculated, delivered with the ease of someone used to winning. "Until now," the prosecutor shot back, his voice sharp and cutting through the stagnant air of the courtroom. He stood with purpose, shoulders squared, eyes hard beneath the harsh courtroom lights. "You expect us to believe a 12-year-old boy over a decorated educator?" Liam's breath quickened. His fists curled so tightly his nails bit into his palms. His heart slammed painfully against his ribs. His legs tensed beneath the bench. He wanted to scream. He wanted to make them believe him. "I'm not making this up!" Liam's voice shot through the courtroom like a whip crack. His chest heaved as he stood, his eyes burning with the threat of tears he refused to shed. "Sit down." Judge Benson's voice cut through the tension like a knife. Her eyes sharpened beneath the rim of her glasses as she glared at Turner's lawyer. "Counselor, you'll get your chance to respond properly. For now, sit down." The lawyer hesitated, his jaw tightening as he smoothed the front of his suit jacket and lowered himself back into his seat. His expression remained polished, but the slight tension in his mouth betrayed the first sign of strain. Jessica Parker stood abruptly, her face flushed red with anger. "My son wouldn't lie about something like this," she said, her voice rising. Her eyes were blazing, her hands trembling as they gripped the edge of the bench in front of her. "My client," Turner's lawyer began. "No," Jessica cut him off. "Liam wouldn't lie." Her gaze locked on Turner, eyes narrowed. "And you know it." Suddenly, Turner stood. "This is ridiculous," he said, his calm exterior splintering beneath the weight of the accusation. His eyes flashed cold beneath the overhead lights. He stood tall, his posture stiff with barely contained anger. "He's a child. He doesn't understand what he saw." Liam shot to his feet, his face flushed with heat, his chest tightening painfully. "I know what I saw," he shouted. His voice cracked, but his eyes blazed with determination. His gaze locked on Turner, and for the first time, Turner's mask slipped. "You killed Mr. Carson!" Gasps erupted across the courtroom. The jury exchanged wide-eyed glances. Someone in the back row whispered, "Oh my God!" Turner's eyes narrowed dangerously. His lips pressed into a thin line. His lawyer reached out to pull him back into his seat, but Turner's shoulders stiffened. His gaze was fixed on Liam. Cold, calculating. "Liam!" Jessica's voice was sharp, cutting through the tension, but Liam barely registered it. His heart was hammering too hard. Blood roared in his ears. "You don't know what you're saying." Turner's voice was low, dangerous. "I know exactly what I'm saying." Liam's voice shook, but his eyes didn't waver. "I saw you push him. I saw you." Turner's jaw flexed. A dark shadow passed over his face, the first real crack in his composure. His nostrils flared. His hands curled into fists at his sides. "Liam!" Jessica reached out toward her son. Turner's eyes slid toward her, sharp and cold. His mouth curled slightly. "Perhaps the boy's confused," he said smoothly. "Or maybe he's being coached." Jessica's face hardened. "Don't you dare!" The prosecutor's chair scraped loudly against the floor as he stood. "Your Honor," he said, his voice cutting through the growing storm of voices, "we need to establish clarity here. Mr. Turner is under oath. If the boy witnessed a crime, this is ridiculous!" Turner snapped. His calm facade was gone now, stripped away by the heat of the moment. His face darkened, his hands flattening against the defense table. "I didn't push anyone. The video is grainy at best. It proves nothing." "You shoved him," Liam said, his voice clear despite the tremor beneath it. "I saw you." Turner's lawyer stood. "Your Honor, this is emotional manipulation. We are relying on the memory of a frightened child." "A frightened child who saw the truth," the prosecutor cut in, "and who had the courage to say it out loud." Turner's mouth twisted into something dangerously close to a smile. His eyes glinted with something dark and venomous beneath the surface. "You don't understand what you're accusing me of," Turner said softly, his eyes locked on Liam. "I understand perfectly," Liam said. Turner's smile sharpened. "Careful, Liam." "Is that a threat?" Jessica's voice rose sharply. Turner's lawyer held up a hand. "My client is simply pointing out that the boy, he knows exactly what he's doing," Jessica cut in. Her voice was sharp and unwavering. "And you know it too." Turner's lawyer took a breath, steadying himself. He opened his mouth to respond, but the prosecutor spoke first. "Mr. Turner," the prosecutor said, his voice low, controlled, "were you or were you not the last person seen with Mr. Carson on the night of his death?" Turner's gaze remained steady. He leaned forward slightly. "I have nothing to say at this time." "Because you know what the answer is," Liam said. His heart hammered so hard it hurt. His breath shook. Turner's mouth twitched, the smallest flicker of irritation beneath the smooth veneer. He said nothing. Jessica's hand pressed against Liam's back. "You're doing fine," she whispered. "Stay strong." "I'm not lying," Liam said, his voice rising again. "You pushed him. You killed him." Turner's jaw tightened. His gaze darkened. "Enough." Judge Benson's voice cut through the room like a whip. Her gavel struck hard against the wood. "This is a court of law, not a shouting match." Liam's chest heaved. His hands trembled. He forced himself to sit down. His legs were shaking beneath the table. Jessica's arm wrapped around his shoulders, pulling him close. Turner sat down slowly. His lawyer leaned toward him and whispered something in his ear. Turner didn't respond. His gaze was fixed on Liam, cold and calculating. Judge Benson's gaze swept the room. "We will take a short recess before proceeding," she said firmly. "Bailiff, escort Mr. Turner to the holding room." The gavel struck again. Turner stood as the bailiff approached, but his eyes never left Liam. His smile was gone. His expression was flat and empty, except for his eyes. His eyes burned cold and sharp beneath the surface, like ice over black water. As the bailiff led him away, Turner's gaze slid toward Jessica. His mouth curled slightly. "You should watch yourself," he said, just low enough that only Liam and Jessica could hear. Jessica's arm tightened around Liam. Her eyes blazed with quiet fury. "Keep walking," the bailiff ordered. Turner's smile widened, cold and sharp. As the heavy courtroom doors closed behind him, Liam's breath finally released in a sharp exhale. His chest ached. His hands were still trembling. Jessica pulled him close, her hand resting on the back of his head. "You were brave," she whispered. Liam's eyes stayed fixed on the door where Turner had disappeared. His heart was still hammering. His body was still tense, because even as Turner disappeared from view, Liam could feel it. The quiet threat beneath his gaze. This wasn't over, not even close. That night, Liam woke to the sharp sound of glass shattering downstairs. The noise cut through the heavy stillness of the house like a knife. His eyes flew open, heart hammering so hard it made his chest hurt. He lay frozen beneath his blanket, listening to the echoing silence that followed. For a second, he thought maybe he'd imagined it. Maybe it was just a dream. But then, footsteps. Soft, deliberate, slow. Liam's breath quickened. His eyes darted toward the darkened hallway outside his bedroom door. His mother's room was quiet. No light beneath the door. "Mom?" His voice was barely above a whisper, but even that felt too loud. The footsteps creaked on the stairs. Slow, measured. Someone was in the house. "Liam," a voice called softly. His stomach plummeted. His skin turned cold. He knew that voice. It was Mr. Turner's. "Liam." The voice came again, soft and coaxing, like someone trying to lure a stray dog. "Come downstairs." Liam's blood went cold. His muscles locked as adrenaline flooded his veins. His mind screamed at him to move, but his limbs felt heavy and useless. His hands gripped the edge of the blanket so hard his knuckles turned white. The footsteps creaked again, the sound of leather soles brushing against the wood of the stairs. Turner wasn't in a hurry. He was taking his time. "Liam." Turner's voice floated up the staircase. Calm. Casual. Too calm. Liam scrambled out of bed, his heart hammering painfully against his ribs. His feet barely touched the floor as he stumbled toward the door. He shoved it closed and twisted the lock hard. His hands shook as he backed away, his breath quick and shallow. The door handle rattled. Liam's breath hitched. The handle twisted again. "Liam!" Turner's voice sharpened just slightly, the softness peeling away to reveal the steel beneath. "Open the door." Liam stumbled backward, tripping over the edge of the rug. His ankle twisted painfully beneath him, but he didn't stop moving. His fingers trembled as he grabbed his phone from the nightstand and jabbed the emergency number. 911, what's your emergency? This is Liam Parker. His voice was shaking, too loud, too fast. I think someone's trying to break into my house. Where are you right now? My bedroom, Liam whispered, his eyes locked on the handle. The operator's voice remained calm. Can you see who it is? Yes. Liam's throat was so tight the word barely came out. It's Mr. Turner. The operator's tone sharpened immediately. Stay on the line. Officers are on their way. The handle twisted violently. Bang! Liam jumped. A loud thud hit the door, the sound of something heavy striking it. Another bang. The wood splintered slightly beneath the pressure. Liam? Turner's voice was darker now. The warmth was gone. Open the door. Tears burned in Liam's eyes. His breath came in ragged gasps. Officers are 3 minutes out. The operator's voice came through the phone. Stay on the line. Another slam. The door frame groaned beneath the pressure. The thin lock wouldn't hold much longer. Liam, Turner's voice sharpened. You don't want to make me come in there. Liam's hand tightened around the phone, his back pressed against the wall, his body shaking so hard his knees knocked together. Please hurry, he whispered. Another bang. The wood splintered at the edges. A sharp crack split the air. And then, silence. Liam's breath hitched painfully in his chest. He stared at the door, his pulse hammering in his ears. A long beat of nothing. Then footsteps, soft, retreating down the stairs. Liam's entire body trembled. His legs were so weak he almost slid to the floor. His breath rasped in his throat as he strained to listen. The creak of the front door opening. A faint shuffle. Then, a flash of blue and red lights through the cracks in the curtains. A loud voice barked from outside. Step away from the house. Hands where we can see them. Liam gasped, sagging against the wall. His body shook violently as relief crashed through him. He stumbled toward the window. Outside, 2 police officers stood with their guns drawn. Their flashlights illuminated the dark outline of a figure standing on the porch. Mr. Turner. He stood perfectly still beneath the glow of the lights, his hands at his sides. He was wearing black gloves. His shirt sleeves were rolled up slightly, exposing the pale skin of his wrists. A crowbar lay at his feet. One of the officers stepped closer, hand on the grip of his holstered gun. Put your hands where we can see them. Turner's gaze lifted toward the window. His eyes locked with Liam's, and then he smiled. Calm, cold. Slowly, deliberately, he raised his hands. His expression never changed. I was just checking on the boy, Turner said smoothly, his voice carrying through the night air. Making sure he was safe. Down on your knees, the officer barked. Turner's smile widened. He lowered himself to his knees. 2 officers moved in. One of them yanked Turner's arms behind his back and locked the handcuffs around his wrists. Turner didn't resist. His gaze stayed on Liam, unblinking. His mouth curved into the faintest smile as the handcuffs clicked shut. The officer pulled him to his feet. Turn around. Turner's gaze lingered on Liam for one last chilling moment. We'll talk soon, he said quietly. Liam's breath caught painfully. His hands pressed against the window pane. His heart hammered so hard his chest hurt. Jessica's door flew open down the hall. Liam! He spun toward her. Jessica's face was pale and terrified as she rushed toward him, grabbing his face between her hands. Are you okay? Are you hurt? Liam shook his head, his breath hitching painfully. He was here. Mom, he was in the house. Jessica's eyes widened. Oh my God. She pulled him into a tight embrace, her hands clutching the back of his head. It's okay. It's okay. He's gone. Liam's whole body trembled. He buried his face against her shoulder, his breath shaky. No, Mom. He's not gone. He's not going to stop. Jessica's hand slid to the back of his head. Shh, it's over. But it wasn't. Through the window, Liam watched as Turner was loaded into the back of the squad car. His wrists were cuffed behind his back, but his posture remained straight, his expression disturbingly calm. His eyes, cold and dead beneath the flashing lights, never left Liam. As the squad car door closed, Turner's lips curved upward in a small, knowing smile. Liam's hands curled into fists at his sides. His pulse hammered painfully in his ears. Turner wasn't gone. He wasn't finished. Liam could feel it. In his bones, in the cold dread seeping into his chest. This wasn't over. Not even close. In the courtroom the next day, Turner's lawyer claimed that Turner had been set up. Why would he try to harm the boy while under investigation? The lawyer argued, his voice smooth and confident. His tone was calculated, too measured, too rehearsed. He stood in the center of the courtroom, his dark suit crisp, his hands clasped together in front of him like he was delivering a sermon. His gaze moved over the jury with deliberate ease, making each word land carefully. My client is an experienced educator with an impeccable record, the lawyer continued. He's dedicated his life to helping children, not hurting them. He turned toward the judge, his brows lifting with a carefully performed mixture of disbelief and quiet authority. The idea that Mr. Turner would jeopardize his career, his entire life, by breaking into a student's home while under investigation is absurd. Clearly, there's been some kind of misunderstanding. Liam sat frozen, his hands curled into fists on his lap. His chest was tight, his breath shallow. He could feel Turner's gaze burning into him from across the room. Slowly, deliberately, Turner's gaze settled on him. His eyes were cold, calculating. Liam's stomach twisted violently. His breath hitched painfully in his throat. His heart hammered so hard he could feel it in his ears. Across the courtroom, Turner's mouth twitched. He mouthed the words silently. You're lying. Liam's hands tightened into white-knuckled fists. His mouth went dry. He felt like the ground beneath his feet was shifting, tilting dangerously beneath him. He's trying to scare me, Liam whispered. His voice barely carried beyond his mother's shoulder. Jessica's arm tightened around him. Stay strong, honey, she whispered. Her hand slid down to his, squeezing it tightly, but her voice was strained. Her body was tense. She was scared, too. Liam swallowed hard. His eyes darted toward the jury. Some of them looked doubtful, uncertain. The carefully controlled tone of Turner's lawyer was doing its job, planting seeds of doubt, twisting reality. Liam's chest tightened painfully. He could feel it slipping. The certainty, the clarity of the truth. It was starting to blur beneath the weight of Turner's cold gaze and the calm, clinical tone of his lawyer. Turner's lawyer turned toward the jury, his expression serious, almost sympathetic. We must ask ourselves why this boy would accuse Mr. Turner of something so severe. What would motivate a child to lie about something so grave? Liam's jaw clenched. I'm not lying. His voice was sharp, but his throat tightened painfully as he said it. Turner's lawyer's gaze slid toward Liam. His eyes sharpened. Trauma can do strange things to the mind. Memory isn't always reliable. We've seen this before. Confusion after a tragic event. His hands spread apart in a smooth, open gesture. Is it possible that Liam misinterpreted what he saw? That his young mind reconstructed the event in a way that felt true to him? Liam's hands trembled. His breath quickened. I saw him, Liam said, his voice louder this time. I'm not confused. And yet, the evidence is inconclusive. Turner's lawyer turned toward the jury again. The video shows an altercation, but we don't see Mr. Turner pushing Mr. Carson. And even if the push did occur, was it intentional or was it an accident? Liam's heart pounded painfully. It wasn't an accident. Liam. Judge Benson's sharp voice cut through the tension. Sit down. Liam's breath shook. He sank back into his seat, his hands trembling in his lap. Jessica pulled his hand into hers, her fingers wrapping around his wrist. The lawyer's gaze darkened. His mouth curled slightly. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, I ask you to consider, would a man like Mr. Turner, an experienced teacher, a respected figure in this community, truly be capable of something so monstrous? Liam's jaw tightened painfully. His knuckles were white where his hands curled into fists. His heart slammed violently against his chest. He did it, Liam said, his voice low but sharp. I saw him do it. Liam. Jessica's voice was soft, calming. Her hand brushed against his knuckles. Breathe. Turner's lawyer smiled faintly, like he had already won. His gaze slid toward Turner. My client is not the monster he's been painted as. Turner's eyes never left Liam. His mouth curled into the smallest smile, cold and dangerous. My client is the real victim here, the lawyer continued smoothly. This boy has clearly suffered tremendous emotional trauma. It's understandable that his mind might create a narrative to explain what happened that night, but narratives are not facts. I'm not confused, Liam said sharply. His chest heaved, his face was flushed with heat. Turner's lawyer's smile sharpened. He took a slow step toward the jury. Think about it, he said, his voice low and steady. Who's more believable? A scared, confused child, or a well-respected member of this community? Liam's eyes burned. His whole body shook with frustration. I'm not confused, he shouted, his voice cracking. He did it! He killed Mr. Carson! Liam! Judge Benson's gavel slammed hard against the wood. That's enough! Liam's breath came fast and shallow. He sat back down, his pulse racing painfully. Jessica's arm wrapped around his shoulders. Turner's lawyer smiled faintly. No further questions. Turner's gaze settled on Liam. His eyes were dark and cold beneath the fluorescent lights. His mouth curved faintly upward, like he was amused, like he had already won. Liam's chest felt tight. His throat burned. The prosecutor stood. Mr. Turner's lawyer has painted this situation as a misunderstanding, but the fact remains that Mr. Carson is dead, and Liam Parker is the only living witness to that crime. Turner's lawyer sat back, his mouth twitching into a confident smile. The defense would have you believe that a 12-year-old child is incapable of distinguishing reality from imagination, the prosecutor continued, that his trauma has clouded his judgment. But this child has been consistent. From the beginning, he has stated clearly and repeatedly that he saw Mr. Turner push Mr. Carson. Turner's smile faded. His eyes narrowed slightly. The evidence supports Liam's testimony, the prosecutor said, and Mr. Turner's behavior, his attempt to intimidate this child in his own home, speaks for itself. Turner's lawyer stood. Objection. Overruled, Judge Benson said. Liam's heart thudded painfully in his chest. The prosecutor turned toward Liam. His expression softened. Liam, are you sure about what you saw? Liam's mouth tightened. His pulse hammered painfully in his ears. He forced himself to look directly at Turner. I saw him, Liam said, his voice steady now. I saw him push Mr. Carson. Turner's gaze sharpened. His smile disappeared completely. Judge Benson's eyes darkened. Court is adjourned for recess. The gavel struck hard. Turner's lawyer leaned toward him, whispering something. Turner didn't respond. His gaze stayed on Liam as he stood, Jessica's hand wrapped tightly around Liam's. Her breath hitched as Turner walked past them on his way toward the exit. As Turner passed, his gaze slid toward Liam. His mouth curved slightly. Liam's pulse quickened. His hands trembled. Turner's eyes gleamed coldly beneath the harsh lights. His smile widened. Liam's chest tightened painfully. His stomach twisted. His breath hitched in his throat. Turner didn't say a word. He didn't have to. Liam understood the message perfectly. This isn't over. On the third day of the trial, the prosecution presented a letter found in Turner's desk at school. The courtroom was eerily still as the prosecutor approached the evidence table. His expression was cold, focused, as he held up a sealed plastic bag containing a crisp white envelope. The thin paper inside was slightly crumpled, as though it had been hastily stuffed away, forgotten, or maybe hidden. The sound of the plastic crinkling beneath the fluorescent lights was unnervingly loud. "This letter," the prosecutor said, his voice cutting through the heavy silence, "was recovered from Mr. Turner's desk at the school." His eyes narrowed. "It was addressed to Mr. Carson." Liam's breath caught painfully in his chest. His heartbeat thundered in his ears as the prosecutor held up the letter. He already knew what it said. The prosecutor pulled out the letter with deliberate slowness, unfolding it carefully as though handling a delicate piece of evidence. His gloved fingers pressed the creases flat as he raised the letter for the courtroom to see. His voice was measured, calm, and sharp as steel. "If you say anything, you know what will happen." A collective gasp rippled through the room. Someone in the back row muttered a curse under their breath. The quiet rustle of shifting bodies filled the heavy silence. Even the court officers at the back of the room looked visibly tense. Liam's chest tightened. His gaze darted toward Mr. Turner. Turner's face was pale. His eyes darkened as the words settled over the room like a slow-moving fog. His mouth pressed into a thin line, his jaw tightening beneath the sharp collar of his shirt. "Let the record show," the prosecutor continued, "that the handwriting in this letter matches a sample provided by Mr. Turner." Liam's pulse spiked dangerously. His hands curled into the fabric of his pants beneath the table. His eyes widened as he stared at the letter. The handwriting was familiar, too familiar. The slight forward slant, the sharp angles at the top of each letter. It was exactly the same as the comments Mr. Turner used to write on his school reports. The prosecutor set the letter down on the evidence table. "Your Honor, I'd like to submit this into evidence." Turner's lawyer shot to his feet. "Objection!" His voice was sharp and desperate now, the calm control from the previous days finally slipping. "We don't have confirmation that this letter is authentic. There's no context. This could have been planted." Judge Benson's gaze sharpened. "Are you suggesting that the prosecution planted evidence?" Turner's lawyer hesitated. His mouth opened and closed once, twice, then tightened into a hard line. "I'm suggesting," the lawyer said carefully, "that there's no proof that my client wrote this letter with the intent to threaten Mr. Carson." The prosecutor's mouth curled faintly. "Intent is a matter for the jury to decide." He turned toward the judge. "Your Honor, we have already submitted samples of Mr. Turner's handwriting for analysis. The initial report shows a 98% match with the writing on this letter." Liam's breath hitched. Jessica's hand tightened around his. "You did it?" she whispered. Her voice was shaky, her breath catching as her eyes filled with tears. "You told the truth." Liam's eyes didn't leave Turner. Turner's face was deathly pale now. His hands were trembling where they rested on the defense table. The smooth, impenetrable mask he'd worn for the entire trial was starting to crack, the thin veneer of calm splintering under the weight of the truth. Turner's jaw tightened. His eyes flashed dangerously as he leaned toward his lawyer, whispering something hurried and sharp. His lawyer's eyes widened slightly. He shook his head. "It's not what it looks like." Turner's voice cracked through the courtroom like a whip. Every head in the room turned toward him. Turner stood abruptly, the legs of his chair scraping loudly against the polished floor. His hands slammed down on the table hard enough to rattle the glasses of water at his side. His eyes flashed with cold, desperate anger. "I never wrote that letter," he shouted. "It's a forgery." "Mr. Turner," Judge Benson's voice cut through the tension, "you will sit down and control yourself." Turner's mouth twisted. His eyes burned with a dangerous intensity. "This is a setup." His gaze darted toward Liam, sharp and vicious. "You did this," he hissed. "You set me up." Jessica shot to her feet. "Don't you dare talk to him!" Her voice was fierce, shaking with rage. The bailiff stepped forward. "Mr. Turner, sit down." Turner's gaze stayed locked on Liam. His eyes burned cold and dark beneath his graying brows. His hands curled into fists against the table. His chest rose and fell sharply as he breathed through clenched teeth. Liam's stomach tightened painfully. His chest ached beneath the weight of Turner's gaze. He wanted to speak, to tell him he was lying, but his throat had closed up completely. Turner's lawyer pulled him down by the sleeve of his jacket. Turner resisted for a moment, his body rigid with tension. Then he sat. His jaw was tight. His hands flattened against the surface of the table. His eyes never left Liam. Judge Benson's gaze was cold and severe as she turned toward Turner. "This court will recess while the letter undergoes final authentication," she said. "But let me make one thing clear. Any further outbursts from you, Mr. Turner, and you will be held in contempt." Turner's mouth curled into a sharp, dangerous smile. "Understood." Judge Benson's gavel struck hard against the wood. The courtroom buzzed with restless energy as the jury filed out. The murmur of voices rose and fell beneath the heavy air. Liam's breath was still coming too fast, too shallow. His hands were trembling. Jessica crouched beside him, brushing a hand over his hair. "It's okay," she whispered. "He's losing." Liam's eyes stayed locked on Turner. Turner sat perfectly still at the defense table. His lawyer was speaking to him in low, hurried tones, but Turner's expression remained blank. His eyes remained fixed on Liam, cold and sharp. His mouth curled slightly at the edges. Liam's chest tightened painfully. He could feel the threat beneath Turner's gaze, the quiet promise hidden beneath the thin veneer of composure. Turner's gaze slid toward Jessica. His smile widened slightly. Liam's breath hitched. He clenched his hands into fists beneath the table. Jessica's hand brushed against his cheek. "It's over," she whispered. Liam's heart pounded. His eyes burned. But Turner's gaze told him otherwise. This wasn't over. Not yet. As Turner stood to follow his lawyer out of the courtroom, his gaze lingered on Liam for one last moment. His eyes narrowed slightly. His smile sharpened. Liam's breath quickened. Turner's mouth moved soundlessly. "This isn't over." The bailiff opened the courtroom doors. Turner walked past, his posture straight and controlled. His eyes never left Liam. Liam's chest heaved painfully. His breath stuck in his throat. Jessica's hand tightened around his wrist. "Liam?" "He's not done," Liam whispered. His hands curled into fists. "He's not going to stop." Jessica's hand tightened. "We're going to finish this," she whispered. "Together." But Liam could feel it. Beneath the surface of Turner's gaze, beneath the thin, carefully maintained calm of his expression. Turner wasn't done. Not even close. Turner was found guilty of manslaughter and attempted intimidation of a witness. The words echoed through the courtroom like a shot, cutting through the tense silence with brutal finality. For a split second, no one moved. The air was so thick Liam could barely breathe. The weight of the verdict settled over the room like a suffocating fog. heavy, unrelenting. A ripple of murmurs passed through the audience. Someone in the back row gasped. A reporter's pen scratched furiously against a notepad. A soft, broken sob rose from the back corner of the room. Mr. Carson's widow, clutching a crumpled tissue to her face. Liam's breath hitched painfully in his chest. His hands were shaking where they rested on his lap. His head spun. His heart pounded in his ears. He heard the judge's gavel strike the wood. Once, twice, but it sounded distant, muted beneath the rushing sound of blood in his head. Guilty. Liam's chest seized. His breath caught painfully in his throat. He felt Jessica's hand slip into his, her fingers tightening reassuringly around his knuckles. He squeezed back, his grip desperate and shaking. His vision blurred. He blinked rapidly, trying to clear it. "It's over," the judge's voice cut through the haze. "Mr. Turner is remanded to custody immediately pending sentencing. Court is adjourned." The sound of the gavel striking down a final time sent a sharp crack through the courtroom. Chairs scraped against the floor as the jury stood to leave. Turner's lawyer leaned toward him, speaking quickly and low, but Turner didn't seem to hear him. His gaze remained steady, fixed on the polished wood of the table in front of him. His hands were clasped together, knuckles white beneath the cuffs of his suit jacket. Liam's eyes darted toward Turner just as the bailiff approached. "Stand up," the officer said. His voice was clipped, professional. Turner's head lifted slowly. His gaze was sharp and cold as he rose to his feet. His movements were smooth, controlled, too controlled for someone who had just been convicted of manslaughter. His expression remained carefully composed, but there was a dark glint beneath the surface. The officer stepped behind him and pulled Turner's hands behind his back. The sharp click of metal handcuffs locking into place sent a cold shiver down Liam's spine. Turner's mouth didn't so much as twitch. His shoulders remained squared, his chin lifted. Liam's breath quickened as Turner's eyes drifted toward him. Cold, dark, full of quiet hatred. Turner's gaze held steady as the officer guided him toward the exit. His eyes never left Liam. Liam's stomach twisted painfully. His hands curled into fists on his lap. His breath came too fast. His chest felt tight, like someone was pressing down on him. His body screamed at him to look away, to break eye contact. But he couldn't. Jessica's hand slid to the back of Liam's head. "It's over," she whispered. But it didn't feel over. Turner's mouth curled into a thin smile, faint, almost imperceptible, as the bailiff led him toward the side exit. His gaze sharpened, his eyes narrowing slightly. A silent message, a promise. Liam didn't look away. He forced himself to sit taller, his jaw tightening. He wasn't going to give Turner the satisfaction. The courtroom doors swung shut behind them with a heavy clang. Turner's dark gaze disappeared behind the polished wood. Liam exhaled shakily. His hands were still trembling. His chest burned with the effort of breathing. His throat was painfully dry. Jessica knelt down in front of him, her hands sliding up to cup his face. Her eyes were bright with tears, but her smile was steady and warm. "I'm so proud of you," she whispered, brushing her thumb across his cheek. Liam's throat tightened painfully. He swallowed hard. "I just told the truth," he said softly. Jessica's hands slid into his hair. "You were brave." Her voice broke slightly. "So brave." Liam's eyes burned. His lower lip trembled. He pressed his forehead against his mother's shoulder, letting out a shaky breath. Jessica's arms tightened around him. He felt her hand slide across his back, steady and reassuring. He squeezed his eyes shut. His body sagged against her as the tension began to unravel, slowly, painfully. His muscles ached from how hard he'd been holding himself together. The doors at the back of the courtroom creaked open. A cluster of reporters swarmed forward, Microphones raised, cameras flashing. The bailiffs moved in, forming a protective wall between them and the reporters. Questions were being shouted over one another, voices overlapping and blending into noise. "Did you know about the letter? How is the family responding to the verdict? How does it feel, knowing you were right? Do you feel safe now?" Liam's heart kicked painfully in his chest at that last question. "Do you feel safe now?" Jessica's arm tightened around him. "Come on," she whispered. Liam stood, his legs shaky beneath him. Jessica's arm slipped around his shoulders as she guided him toward the side exit, away from the growing chaos of the press. His breath still felt shaky. His chest still ached. A rush of cold air hit his face as they stepped outside. The sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows over the concrete steps of the courthouse. Police cars were parked along the curb, lights flashing dimly in the late afternoon haze. Liam's eyes drifted toward the police van parked at the edge of the street. Through the small barred window, he saw Turner sitting inside. His face was partially in shadow, but his eyes were visible beneath the dim light. Cold, empty. Turner's gaze met Liam's through the glass. His expression remained carefully blank, but his eyes were dark and hard. The van door slammed shut. Liam's heart pounded painfully in his chest. His breath hitched. His hands tightened at his sides. Turner's face disappeared behind the darkened glass as the van pulled away from the curb. The sound of the engine rumbled through the quiet street as the vehicle disappeared down the road. Jessica's hand slid to the back of Liam's head. "It's over," she whispered. "He's gone." Liam's eyes stayed fixed on the empty stretch of road where the van had disappeared. His chest felt tight. The tension in his muscles hadn't completely faded. His hands were still trembling. "I don't think it's over," Liam said quietly. Jessica's hand tensed slightly against his back. "He's going to prison." Liam's jaw tightened. "I know." His gaze darkened. "But he's not done." Jessica's mouth pressed into a thin line. Her hand brushed through his hair. "We'll deal with that, if it happens," she said softly. "But for now." Liam exhaled shakily. His body still felt too tense, too wound up. His heart still raced beneath his ribs. Jessica's hand found his. "For now, let's go home." Liam's eyes lingered on the empty road for a long moment. The sun cast long, thin shadows across the pavement. His breath remained shallow and strained. Finally, he turned toward Jessica. His hand slipped into hers. "Okay," he whispered. Jessica smiled faintly and guided him down the courthouse steps. Reporters still shouted questions behind them, but Liam's focus remained fixed on the road ahead. His chest still felt tight. His hands still trembled. But his steps were steady as they crossed the street. Turner was gone. For now. A month later, Liam stood in front of the school at a memorial for Mr. Carson. Jessica placed a hand on his shoulder. "You did the right thing." "I know," Liam said. Principal Carter approached him. "If you ever need anything, Liam, you come to me. You were incredibly brave." As Liam looked at the plaque dedicated to Mr. Carson, he felt a weight lift off his chest. "I just wish I could have saved him," Liam said. Jessica hugged him. "You couldn't have known, but you made sure the truth came out." Liam smiled for the first time in weeks. Justice had been served, and this time the system had listened.